Hey, I'm Dylan. I've been building the V1 of this FarHack, Farcaster hackathon software, and I built it using React Server components because I haven't used them much yet and wanted to get a demo for them. I want to go over what I've thought is cool about server components and some gripes. I don't claim to be an expert on them. I'm not going over the entire concept per se, but I just want to go over my first example of using these server components in a Next.js app. Some things I think are lacking, some things that might take me a little while to get used to, but let's dive right in. So the software isn't anything crazy. You have hackathon pages, different content. One thing you notice though is there's no loading when we wait for the content. It is all coming directly down because server components render all of the React server side, and then there's no waiting for the content to load client side. So what this can enable is some cool stuff where, especially if you're writing just rather simple code in your server component, which here you're just marking as an async function, or you don't have to because it's the general function in Next.js. I can make a direct database query, and instead of having all of this loading state, just handle the case where there's no data and otherwise fully load the content. This is really cool to be able to load content quickly on the fly. It's really great for different feature flags, like pulling in content you want about the user on your backend, showing them different UIs. And also for AI apps, you can stream in React server components with an AI response to get really cool UIs. So I think that's really cool. Um, One thing that it's worth taking note though from this great article by Josh Comu called Making Sense of React Server Components is there's this boundary where you have server components at the top hierarchy, but once you get down to a client component, which you mark use client and you can use hooks and context in, you cannot then pass server components down as the child here. You've marked what's effectively the client boundary. So a lot of times, right, you'd have state and you would pass some void function that would update the state. You can't really do that. You have to think about the different ways where your data is going to flow. There are certain things that help though. For example, server actions. So for example, in this page here, this is the admin hackathon page. I have a function where I want to be able to add an item as an admin, like add a schedule item, a bounty, whatever. So here in my server component, I'm writing a function and I'm marking it as a use server, meaning this function itself will run on the server. It will essentially run as a post request. And then I can pass it down to the component. So in this example, add item button. This add item button has access to it and just runs it like any other prop. So that's great. That's pretty familiar React, but it's a little annoying when you have to continue to do that all of the time. There are also a bunch of different fun tricks, like if you're using hooks, you use a lot of things like use path names to get the certain path. You can't, again, use hooks in your server components. So for something as small as that, for example, there are certain tricks like setting a header from this great article here, where you essentially just put in the header the path name or the params, etc. That header gets added in your middleware, and then you can just call it using next headers and grab it. So there are certain workarounds there, but certain things that are a little annoying. Um, Other than the client side boundary, which is just going to take a little while for me to get used to, one of the main things that's annoying is optimistic updates. If you go to a site like Lightcast, which is an open Farcaster client that I've built, it uses something called SWR, stale while revalidated. So it has a HTTP built-in function to check for stale data and refresh it as needed. So new content that's coming through, new casts, will just show up on the top of the feed. And this can happen because these requests are happening client side, but in a server side environment where you're using a server function, it's a lot harder to do that. Or if so, you essentially have to re-render the entire parent order component, which isn't optimal if every time there is a new tweet or a new post, for example, you have to refresh the entire page. And so I'm sure maybe there are certain solutions where you're only re-rendering part of the page with the server, but that's just a paradigm I would have to get used to. Versus here, I'm really used to just setting up SWR and it handles fetching all of the content. So again, that was just like a very brief overview of some of my thoughts. If you want to check out this repo and look at the code, it's at farhackxyz/farhack on the hack v1 branch. I can put this in the notes as well, but just wanted to quickly go over it, and feel free to reach out if you have any comments on the repo or server components or anything else. So yeah.